Good morning to you. You. Good good morning to you. Good good morning. Won't you share with a friend or two? Good morning to you. You, good morning to you. You, good morning to you. And many more, and many more. All right. Good morning, and welcome to Daring Dialogues. I'm your host today, Shantae Charles, and this is Wednesday, Relationship Wednesday. It's also Black History Month, so we are going to continue to share some Black history facts with you. It is Relationship Wednesday, and as I said, for the month of February, we're going to be diving into some books. One of them is I Can't Wait to Call You My Wife. We're going to be reading from this today, detailing African American letters of love and family in the Civil War era. But I want to start off with this book today, Black People Invented Everything by Dr. Susan Kumar Das. Very, very fascinating book. And I just want to give you a little taste of what is in here. Introduction. Martin Luther King Jr. quote, almost always the creative, dedicated minority has made the world better. Ever heard of Nipsey Blue? When Crayola asked for a name for its newest shade of blue, that's the name that fans proposed to honor the late Ermias Ashkadam, known to the hip hop world as rapper Nipsey Hussle. What if I told you this enigmatic hue was first developed by the ancient Egyptians over 5,000 years ago? There's always a deep history behind anything interesting. For example, Nipsey wasn't the first to have a color. In his case, his color is Nipsey Blue. In 2016, Cameron released his own Pantone color, Killer Pink. In 2007, Pantone released Jay Z Blue. Maybe Uncle Luke tried to patent Doodoo Brown. Before all of them, there was Carver Purple. In the 1800s, renowned black scientist George Washington Carver reintroduced the world to Tyrian purple, a color that had not been seen since the ancient Phoenicians sailed. This dye revolutionized the textile and clothing industries of the West. Wars were fought over a demand for purple shirts that denoted royalty. The powdered dye was soon worth more than its weight in gold. Until Carver rediscovered the formula, Tyrian purple was a lost art for over 2,000 years. Good morning. This dye was such a unique formulation of pigments that it can't be accurately represented in color photos. Yet Tyrian purple was neither the oldest nor the most advanced artificial pigment made by our amazing ancestors. The first synthetic color made over 5,000 years before Crayola existed was almost identical in hue to the color we now know as Nipsey blue. It was known as Egyptian blue and was once the most valuable pigment in the world. Egyptian blue was no ordinary hue. It emits infrared light you can't see. The science required to make this pigment was so advanced, it is being studied today for its potential in biomedical nanotechnology. It's not without merit to mention that the folks who first pioneered this science looked a lot like the legendary Ermias Ashkadam, known to us as Nipsey Hussle. Just goes to show how history flows in cycles. Are we returning to a time of invention and great productivity? It certainly looks like it. And they have here in the book, I'll try to get as close as I can. That is the Nipsey Blue. All right. And then for my audience over here on Instagram, let me see if I can bring it close to you so you can see it as well. So that is Nipsey Blue. All right. Just a little factoid for this morning. And I would encourage anybody to go and look up Tyrian Purple, Tyrian, Tyrian Purple, and learn a little bit more about that color. All right, we're hopping right into I Can't Wait to Call You My Wife. We are in the continuation of what we started on Monday. So if you missed that broadcast, you can go back and catch the beginning of our reading from this book here. This is part one. We're getting ready to learn a little bit about the life of John M. Washington, who escaped to freedom. By 1862, the year John M. Washington escaped to freedom, people of African descent had been in the Americas for more than 3 centuries. Early on, a few Africans voluntarily and involuntarily were part of the Portuguese and Spanish expeditions to the Americas. They came as soldiers, settlers, servants, and some came as enslaved, but not all. Soon, most Africans arriving in the Americas and the Caribbean were enslaved persons through the highly profitable slave trade. Slavery increased exponentially from 1600 to 1800, making Africans integral to the economic success of European colonization in the Western Hemisphere. Indeed, the social, economic, and political life of all the Americas and their islands depended heavily on enslaving human beings. This slavery was of a particular kind. Slavery in the Western Hemisphere, especially the United States, constituted racial slavery and relied for its justification on a system of beliefs that argued for the moral and intellectual superiority of individuals of European descent and the inferiority of those of sub Saharan African descent. When the British North American colonies united to form the first modern republic, its founders, slaveholders, and non slaveholders alike, believed that slavery would soon decline. In 1776, they thought that they could self righteously blame Britain for African bondage, even though their very break with the empire ensured slavery's expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains, where the British had determined colonial incursion would end, at least temporarily. By 1787, thousands of citizens of and recent immigrants to the new republic had already pushed into Tennessee and Kentucky. They benefited from the constitutional provision allowing for the further importation of Africans through the Atlantic slave trade for at least 2 more decades, assuring slavery's expansion rather than its decline in the southern region. The cotton gin, invented in 1793, only 6 years after founders met in that historical constitutional convention, reduced the time needed for processing cotton while simultaneously increasing the demand for the enslaved to work on the farms and plantations. Recent immigrants and others poured into the southern region of the new country to profit from growing the cotton plants needed to make more available and cheaper cloth. Consequently, many migrants arriving in the southern region in the early 19th century mimicked the quick spiral to wealth, prestige, and political power of former colonists in the southeastern seaboard. Cotton could now be planted everywhere and satisfy the growing demand of British manufacturers, especially after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 gave planters all the benefits of the Mississippi River. In the decades before the Civil War, the Mississippi Valley developed into a cotton kingdom, giving new life to enslavement in the United States. The United States provided most of the cotton imported by British manufacturers. Between 85 and 90% of the American cotton crop was sent to Liverpool annually to be sold in the global market. By 1860, there were more millionaires per capita in Mississippi Valley than anywhere else in the nation. Now that's very interesting considering the condition of Mississippi today. Indeed, the cotton trade represented the largest single sector of the global economy in the first half of the 19th century. Depending on the labor of enslaved people, the South provided two-thirds of the nation's exports as planters invested heavily in land and enslaved persons. Besides cotton, slave labor provided for the planting, cultivating, and harvesting of tobacco, sugar, rice for the regional, national, and international markets. Slave men, women, and children also worked in cities and towns. They were domestics. They worked in stores and warehouses. They worked on the docks. They practiced various trades. Because enslavement was so profitable, investors targeted the bodies of enslaved people early on. Thomas Jefferson recognized the great profitability simply in owning enslaved persons. He advised a friend who had suffered financial losses that if he had any cash left, every farthing of it, he said, should be laid out in land and Negroes, which besides a present support bring a silent profit of from 5 to 10% in this country by the increase in their value. So simply owning enslaved persons could bring a value of 5 to 10%. Black people were adding value just by existing. I want y'all to hear that. They were adding value just by existing. So now you're going to come along in 2025 and tell us that we don't have any value? Somebody's lying. Let's keep reading. Economic historians long ago documented the truth of Jefferson's and other slaveholders' successful financial strategy. On the eve of the Civil War, enslaved people in the aggregate formed the second most valuable capital asset in the United States because we were the cash, the capital, the credit, the insurance, and the mortgage. In a summary of these findings, historian Dave Bryan David notes that, quote, the value of Southern enslaved persons was about 3 times the amount invested in manufacturing or railroads nationwide. So don't let anyone fool you into thinking that all of this generational and stored wealth simply came from other trades. The only asset more valuable than enslaved black people was the land itself. And as the brilliant Dr. Claude Anderson points out, that when black people were emancipated, that value that was on people was transferred to the land because before then, land wasn't worth much without the human resources working the land. But once the human resource was set free, set free ish, then that value began to be transferred onto the land. Jefferson's financial strategy became central to the finances not only of the slaveholding South, but also of Northern industries, shippers, banks, insurers, and investors who weighed risk against returns and invested in slavery. Many of them are still in denial about their past. Demonstrating the centrality of enslavement in the establishment of this new republic, historian Edward Baptist argues that the quote, interlinked expansion of both slavery and financial capitalism was now the driving force in emerging national economic system that benefited the elites and others up and down the Atlantic coast as well as throughout the back country. This is a very, very famous, one of the very famous printed signs um, during that time. And I appreciate the fact that they blew it up so you could see it very, very clearly. And I'm going to hold it so anybody who wants to screenshot it can feel free to screenshot it. All right, you can screenshot it and then in your camera you can reverse the image if it's screenshotting backwards and it will reverse the image for you. Okay. All right, this is from July 2nd, 1853. $1,200 to $1,250 for Negroes in 1853. Now let's do the calculation. Okay, let me see. Go to my Google. Do a little math. Let's go with the low price here. $1,250 in 1853 is how much today? Using the inflation calculator, $1,200 in 1853 is equivalent to 49,125 100 excuse me $49,185.19 today. That was the low end number. So a $50,000 enslaved person. The undersigned wishes to purchase a large lot of Negroes for the New Orleans market. I will pay 49,000 or more for number one young men and $850 to 1,000 for number one young women. In fact, I will pay more for likely Negroes than any other trader in Kentucky. That's what this person put the sign out. My office is adjoining the Broadway Hotel on Broadway, Lexington, Kentucky, where I or my agent can always be found. And look at the name there. He's got his whole name in print. W.M.F. Talbot. Where are the Talbots today? I bet they're still around in Kentucky. Let's keep reading. But we must return to Jefferson's language to get the full import of his meaning. The term increase has a double meaning, referring not only to the accrual of well invested property, but also and particularly to the reproductive capacity of enslaved women. Jefferson noted in a letter to George Washington that he found that the losses by the death of slaves was more than made up for by their increase. Enslaved people kept up over and above their own numbers. That's what he wrote to George Washington. In other words, slave owners and other investors in slavery and those connected directly or indirectly depended heavily upon enslaved women having children to increase their financial gains. Enslaved women who bore children increased slaveholders' investments no matter who the fathers of the progeny were. As historian Tara Hunter notes regarding children of enslaved mothers and white slaveholding fathers, the consequences of the sexual economy of slavery meant that black women gave birth to the capital that helped forge the nation's wealth, typically under the duress of coerced with the very men who sired biracial progeny and turned those same progeny into commodities. How wicked of a person do you have to be in order to turn your own created children into commodities without the blink of an eye or a conscience? How wicked do you have to be to birth children and then traffic them? Because that is what happened. That is what slavery was. So they were birthing the children that they would then turn around and traffic. No moral high road for you. These human assets then were inexhaustible as long as the market demanded the cheapest labor for the highest profit. Most enslaved people worked in the fields of the rural South. They labored from sunup to sundown, and unlike John Washington or Frederick Douglass, almost all were illiterate. As property, enslaved people were bought, sold, inherited, auctioned, traded, and hired out to other slaveholders and non slaveholders, especially if they had particular skills. By the antebellum period, the hired out system was an integral part of enslavement. The slaveholder allowed other slaveholders or non slaveholders to hire enslaved people for wages that were given to the slave owner, not the slave. Hired out enslaved persons often worked in urban businesses and generally experienced greater autonomy than field or domestic enslaved persons. They often lived away from their owners, sometimes in an urban boarding house, paying for their room and board out of their wages, with the remaining wages going to the enslaved holder. Many slaveholders, particularly widows, relied heavily upon the wages of hired out slaves. Laws protecting slavery were established in the colonial era, and they were continually revised and expanded into the Civil War. All 13 colonies established slave status as permanent and inherited through the mother. Colonial slave codes generally controlled enslaved people's movements, requiring written permission for the enslaved to leave the plantation and denied legitimization of their marriages. So I don't want to hear anything about relationships in the black community, marriage rates in the black community, when even at the onset we were denied legitimization of marriage. So unless you're willing to deal with that and talk about that and how that is yet seeped into our culture, save it for somebody else. They forbade enslaved people to meet together in groups of three or more. This is something that you can also see in our culture today. For where there are more than three black people, you will always find someone who is not black in the midst. They forbade enslaved people to meet together in groups of three or more. They forbade ownership of guns and determined types of punishment for the enslaved who broke the laws. Antebellum slave codes, like colonial codes, continued to protect slaveholders' interests in these valuable assets to ensure a stable, profitable, and docile labor force. Laws were fairly consistent throughout the enslaved states. Slave marriages were not legitimized, and the majority of enslaved persons were forbidden to learn to read and to write, to leave the plantation without a pass, to meet in groups of three or more without a white person present, or carry guns or other weapons. The records show that the lash was the main means of control, but slaveholders and their overseers were never without their guns and used them as blunt instruments or to shoot their own enslaved persons. The laws against such deadly force generally protected slave owners, not the enslaved. Violence, therefore, was the central element in this labor system. Without it, slavery would not have existed. Indeed, the consistent degree to which enslaved codes were passed and continually revised, even into the early 1860s, reveals how much Africans and African Americans resisted enslavement. Enslaved men, women, and children constantly challenged their status as the property of other human beings, a commodity to be bought, sold, inherited, traded, and auctioned. Insurrections and rumors of slave revolts were very common. Other forms of violent resistance and included physically resisting a slave owner or overseer, arson, setting things on fire, poisoning their own masters, and even self mutilation. The few enslaved who engaged in this latter act did so to diminish the value of their slaveholders' investment. Running away, slowing down work, and feigning illness were also means of resisting. Other nonviolent means countered slaveholders' insistence that, according to the law, certain human beings were more property than human. One way that enslaved people demonstrated their determination to live lives with meaning and purpose was by consistently attempting to become literate. Enslaved people learned to read and write more than most scholars had previously thought. Recent scholarship reveals that while the majority of slaveholders tried to make slave literacy nearly impossible, not all Southern state legislatures passed laws prohibiting enslaved people from learning to read and write. Though even without laws, slaveholder attitudes generally held sway. Laws against slave literacy, that is, allowing the enslaved to learn rudimentary reading and writing skills, depended upon individual states, and they waxed and waned. Antebellum laws were vague, inconsistent, and often ineffective in preventing the enslaved from becoming literate. Thus, scholars now believe that 5 to 10% of the slave population was semi literate by 1860. In urban areas, a few enslaved persons attended schools taught by free black men and women with their owners' knowledge, while most attended clandestine schools. Some enslaved men and women who were literate held school out of sight of whites, at night and in the woods or in the swamps. Others learned to read and write on an individual basis from adults or older children. Scholars have found that measuring literacy, even among the non enslaved population during the 19th century, is still extremely difficult. New studies now estimate that by 1860, most white Americans were able to read and write, some on a rudimentary level, but about half of the free black American population was literate to some degree. The growing literacy of the entire American population, in part, explains why African Americans desired to understand and use the written word for their own purposes. This is an African American, these are African American enslaved families owned by Mrs. Barnwell circa 1860, 1865. Look at the families. I'll bring this over this way so you can see, and bring it back over this way so you can see. As you can see in this picture, almost every woman is wearing a head wrap. Family was another key means of resistance, whether on large or small plantations or in urban areas. From the 1840s to the 1860s, in spite of the dominant culture's notion of white superiority, slaves denied black inferiority and insisted upon engaging, however tenuously, in universal human activities such as courtship, marriage, and rearing children. Most enslaved couples viewed their marriages as monogamous and permanent. Parents and other members of the enslaved community taught their children that slaveholders were immoral, that slavery was evil, and that resistance was essential. Christianity reinforced these values when a large number of enslaved people became Christians in the decades before the war. Enslaved Christians' interpretation of Christianity even reinforced their willingness to use violence as a means of resistance, as Black Christianity stressed God's wrath against injustice and greed. Slaveholding was, in the minds of African Americans, not only the greatest sin, but also a system that God would end, perhaps violently. This was something that early black Christians in the Americas believed. It's not often stressed. Around 4 million individuals were enslaved in the southern states on the eve of the Civil War. As commodities, the enslaved were subjected to the prevailing threat of being separated from their family members. The enslaved economy fueled regional and national economic growth, expanding into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, and Missouri. At the same time that southeastern planters were moving into the Mississippi Valley to plant profitable crops, slaveholders in Virginia and Maryland had exhausted their soil in the region and were switching from labor intensive tobacco to crops requiring less labor, such as wheat and corn. Contributing to the expansion of the domestic slave trade, Virginia and Maryland slaveholders sold surplus enslaved men and women and some children to traders who then sold them to owners of cotton and sugar plantations in Mississippi Valley. This acceleration of domestic slave trade coincided with the legal end of the Atlantic slave trade in 1808. Good morning. And perpetuated many of slavery's horrors. Families were torn apart, auction blocks and slave pens existed throughout the mid Atlantic region, including across the street from the United States Capitol building. And slave couples moved throughout the region on former Native American trails or via ships traveling down the East Coast to the mouth of the Mississippi and from there into the surrounding valley. I'm glad that this writer here is mentioning how these the same trails that the Native Americans blazed before, they would often use those trail routes to continue to bring enslaved persons through and across the United States. Right here in the town where I live, this town was originally a native indigenous population base, and because there were already trails made here, a group of Germans settled in this particular town, and then those persons that came that had enslaved persons, once they were released, the enslaved persons that were released here that became free black persons settled in this region literally 3 blocks from where I live today. And so even the community that I'm in right now has a lot of history that's tied to how if it was not for native trails blazing this region, people would not have settled here because it was already being slightly developed through the trading routes of the indigenous people. Back to the reading. Thus, the profitability of cotton ensured the constant instability and vulnerability of most Black lives. The more profitable it was for cotton to grow, the less stable that Black lives could become because you could be sold off to any number of plantations to continue this particular trade. Even when the price of cotton fell, planters often went bankrupt, leading to mass breakups of enslaved families and communities. The threat of being sold hung over the head of every enslaved person. There was never a time when you were not under threat of being sold or being separated from your family. Women of childbearing age were as likely to be sold as men. Between 1820 and 1860, as many as 1 million people were sold into the Deep South, and 50% of enslaved sales during the antebellum period resulted in breaking up families. As historian Walter Johnson reminds us, we cannot distinguish between the work that the enslaved did, the economy that placed them there, and the ways in which they lived their lives. Most Black men, women, and children's lives on the eve of the Civil War were integrally linked to their labor. The British and American demand for cotton was not the only reason enslaved people were sold. Slaveholders' wills, their debts, their desires to purchase any number of products also forced apart some members of enslaved families throughout the South. Too often, children were separated from their parents, as were spouses and siblings, never to see or hear from one another again. Their last memory of a wife, husband, brother, sister, or child might be of that person being overtly taken from a plantation by a slave trader, or when members of a family were sold separately on the auction block. In the North, while slavery had never been a dominant form of labor, colonists did use slave laborers along with indentured or non indentured white laborers in the region's diversified economics. These economies required less intensive and more seasonal labor. Yet, enslaved people were a significant part of colonial northern labor, especially in the first half of the 18th century. They worked mostly on farms or in urban areas as domestics, and increasingly in the booming maritime industry into the early 19th century. In addition to the perverse and pervasive presence of slavery, there had always been a small but significant population of free black individuals over the centuries. Not everyone who came to the Americas was enslaved. There were, in fact, free black families who remained free throughout the period of enslavement. In the colonial era, this population was mainly a mixture of people of African, European, and Native American ancestry, and was generally the progeny of white or Native American mothers and black fathers. During the Revolutionary War era, the free black population grew incrementally in the North and Chesapeake Bay region as ideas of universal human freedom spread on both sides of the Atlantic, causing some slaveholders, especially Quakers, to free their enslaved persons. Slavery declined not only because of humanitarian ideas, but also because European immigration increased, providing labor for farmers and merchants. Also, white workers resented competing with the cheaper slave labor for certain jobs. You know how they resent the current day immigrants. In the newly established northern states, then, economics, not humanitarian ideals, contributed to the abolition of slavery. At the turn of the 19th century, abolition laws were passed in the northern states, resulting in a mostly free black population by the 1840s. It's important to note that the system of northern abolition was so prolonged that scholars argue that emancipation in the United States was far more protracted than anywhere else in the Americas. By the first decade of the 19th century, most northern states had provided for gradual abolition, defined as freeing the children of enslaved women born after gradual abolition acts were passed. In other words, gradual abolition freed no one, ensuring that, though declining to a certain degree, slavery continued in the North into the 1840s. The children born after the passage of these laws were apprenticed to individuals, usually the slaveholder of the mother, to work until adulthood or beyond as a means to compensate for the initial investment. These children and young adults could be sold or traded just as their parents were. So again, you see how they continue to involve and evolve the idea of slavery. It wasn't just, okay, it wasn't just, oh, the 13th Amendment. No, it wasn't just that. They are continuing to evolve the notion of slavery. I'm going to stop here for today. We are going to continue to read on about the persistence of enslavement in the North. Tomorrow we'll look at the southern states in the established laws, but we will take a pause for some of this reading and we'll be talking some more about forgiveness on tomorrow. All right. I hope you learned a lot more about the process of enslavement than you knew before. As they said, as more research is being done, they're coming to find out that more people were actually literate than was thought. All right. I am going to open it up if you would like to share your thoughts on what we have read today. Remember, we started out with this book, Black People Invented Everything, and we talked a little bit about the invention of some colors that dated as far back as the Egyptian times. And then today we started reading some more about the history of enslavement here in the United States. If you are watching by YouTube, I want to thank you for your time and attention. We are continuing this conversation on Instagram. If you'd like to join us over there, we will see you in a moment.